Hey everyone, welcome to podcast number 8, Growth and Division. It's going to be a big one today. We're going to be focusing on from about 1820 to 1860. So a lot of stuff here. Manifest Destiny, Compromise of 1850, Sectionalism, Dred Scott, and then Lincoln arrives on the scene. So let's get a move on here. I guess where we're going to start is this concept of Manifest Destiny. Manifest Destiny is this idea that the United States and the American people basically are almost like God's chosen people of the Western Hemisphere, that God has this plan for America, and that it's our destiny to settle all the way to the Pacific Ocean. And at this time, many Americans believed in this idea. And so it's actually kind of amazing when you think about it. You know, you look at just how quickly this country expands after the Revolutionary War. I mean, we get all this land east of the Mississippi, from Great Britain with the Treaty of Paris, and so we become a pretty big nation with that, obviously. And then our third president's able to get us the Louisiana Purchase here in 1803. So you have 1783 Treaty of Paris, 1803 Louisiana Purchase. We gobble up Florida, and one of the more humorous stories in American history. And then by the 1840s, before 1850 even starts, we have Oregon country, we have Southwest America here from Mexican Secession, and we have Texas as well. So we really push really fast to the west here. And this idea that America should keep pushing west, that we have a God-given right to push west, is manifest destiny. And if you're in the way, you better get out of the way. And so America just pushes west until we get to the good old Pacific Ocean over here. Okay? When we talk about manifest destiny, one of the principal things we look at is the Mexican-American War. James Polk becomes president in 1845, and he's typically referred to as a dark horse candidate. And what that means is that going into the nominating convention, he was not one of the main candidates. And eventually he was picked as kind of a compromise. Now, what's interesting about Polk is that he was a self-proclaimed one-term candidate, one-term president, excuse me. He wanted one thing and pretty much one thing only, and that pretty much dealt with expansion. Okay, so he's a firm believer in manifest destiny. He very much wanted to push America further to the west, and he did not respect Mexico very much, and we're going to see that based on what he does here. The Mexican-American War is pretty much instigated by America, by the United States and Polk. And there's a couple of important things we have to know here is that the Americans and the Mexicans had a disputed border of where Texas started and where Mexico started. Okay, Mexico thought it was one place, Americans thought it was someplace else. And obviously here you can see what's known as disputed area. So eventually, I guess what Polk does, essentially, to provoke conflict is, and I should say before he provokes the conflict, he does offer to buy much of this territory, but Mexico refuses, is basically, Polk basically has American troops go into basically this disputed territory that the Mexicans considered their territory, and he basically had American troops sit there and wait, kind of just camp out there, knowing that the Mexicans would eventually attack, which they did. And then when they attacked, Polk was able to say American blood on American soil, and kind of had the self-righteous reason he needed to go to war, that we were defending American troops, blah, blah, blah. Now the Whigs are very much against this. They asked for what are called spot resolutions, saying where exactly were our troops when they got shot, and it's never really told to them, kind of thing. So I guess it's a very shady way of starting a war. So anyways, the war goes on. It's not much of a contest. Wouldn't you know it, just by lucky chance, we have some Navy ships and some troops over here in the Pacific Ocean just waiting in the event of a war, and they're able to capture California without a shot fired, really. And then the American armies push into Mexico with Winfield Scott actually leading an army to Mexico City and capturing Mexico City. So Mexico is completely and utterly defeated, and they basically are forced to sign a treaty giving up all this territory here. This is known as Mexican Secession. So you can see all the states that it includes. All right. Now, as we expand and as we grow with Louisiana Purchase, with the Mexican Secession, the expansion of slavery becomes a very hotly debated topic. It's kind of interesting that, if this country hadn't expanded, if we had just stayed at the 13 colonies, would we have gotten into a civil war? Would tensions have been so high if we didn't have to have this constant argument of, should slavery expand, shouldn't it, whatever. Northern senators proposed the Wilmot Proviso, which basically said that slavery is not allowed in new territory. Now, it doesn't pass, and the Southern Senator is able to block it, but it does kind of show that there is this tension building about slavery and the expansion of slavery. So it's important to note that. Also, at this time, during this Manifest Destiny period, we have this party called the Free Soil Party, and basically these guys are all about stopping the expansion of slavery. Okay, they condemn slavery. But they don't condemn slavery on moral grounds. They condemn slavery because they don't want to compete with slaves for jobs, and they also don't want to live around African Americans. So it's not like the Free Soil Party should be confused with this idealistic party that is for the abolition of slavery. That's just not the case. So we do see this party popping up in the election of 1848. Little magician returns. Martin Van Buren runs, a former president, and gets 10% of the vote. So once again, though, we do see this growing tension here with we don't want slavery to expand here. All right. California really kind of messes things up. In around 1850, California basically kind of enters the country as a free state. And when that happens, it gives the free states the advantage in the Senate, which is something the South was obviously very terrified about. And so it's going to create this tension. It's kind of like a boiling point here of, wars feels like it's imminent in the country here. And so there has to be some sort of compromise to avoid conflict here. It should be noted, guys, that in 1850, the South was actually pretty well off. If you look at the South, who was from the South in the government, you have President Taylor, who's a slaveholder. You've got the majority of cabinet were Southerners. The majority of the Supreme Court were Southerners. They had a balance in the Senate. So the South was in decent shape here. But this compromise of 1850 is needed to avoid a civil war, because the South is not going to accept being pushed around in the Senate. They need to have that balance. And so we kind of have this kind of last stand of these legislative giants, all these guys like Henry Clay, Daniel Webster, John Calhoun. All these dudes are really old, and they're going to work something out to avoid a civil war and to avoid secession by the South, because the South is so irate that California has jumped into the nation here. And basically the Compromise of 1850, I'm going to go back to that map here. The Compromise of 1850 basically says a couple things. Number one, California is a free state. Okay. Slave trade is abolished in D.C. Okay. But what they have to give up is they have to give up these regions right here. The North says basically Utah Territory and New Mexico Territory. All this land here, even though part of it is below the Missouri Compromise, all this land here can basically be decided by popular sovereignty, meaning that the people who live there, they can decide whether or not they want that territory to be slave territory or free territory. Okay. In addition to that, the South also gets a fugitive slave law with teeth. So they were always very concerned about slaves running away. The South is able to go ahead and secure that fugitive slave law. Unfortunately for the South, the fugitive slave law backfires. It's considered to be incredibly humane, and many Northerners basically, their opinions change after seeing how some of these slaves are treated, these runaways, and how they're treated. And the North, for the most part, basically doesn't enforce the law, which just infuriates the South even more. So clearly, I mean, if you look at who's the winner, who's the loser in this, I think clearly the North's the winner. And on top of that, delaying the Civil War just allows the North to get stronger through industrialization, immigration, allows the abolition movement to pick up steam. So it's kind of interesting. The South would have been much better off just saying, let's roll right now, let's do this Civil War. Because the longer they waited, the more industrialized the North got, and the more disadvantages the South were able. The more disadvantages kind of piled onto the South there. So anyways, other things that really kind of push us towards this Civil War and lead to more division within the nation is A bunch of books are published that really get the South fired up. Probably the most important one to mention is Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe. Basically talks about just kind of the evils of slavery and breaking families apart kind of thing. And it's a global sensation. Not only is it popular in America, it's popular in Europe. And many historians have gone as far as say that the British government felt like their hands were tied because so many of their people had read this book and were against the South that they would never support the Southern states because of slavery. And so it's very important to recognize that these people, these authors, definitely had a pretty big impact on pushing America towards civil war. In fact, Lincoln was quoted as saying something to the effect of, "So you're the little lady that got this whole war started," referring to Harriet Beecher Stowe. Anyways, more growth continues to add more tension. When Kansas and Nebraska are basically open for settlements, the issue of slavery once again pops up. You have the Kansas and Nebraska Act that's passed, which once again is going to allow for popular sovereignty to decide which way each state goes, whether it's free, whether it's slave, and it just creates kind of a weird kind of series of events where you have all these nut jobs run into these states. You have these violent pro-slavery people. You have these violent abolitionists running with their Beecher rifles right here. New England, immigrant aid society sends 2,000 people with guns. Pro-Southerners run there. There's massive amounts of voter fraud. At one point, there's two governments set up for Kansas, one that's a slave government in Shawnee Mission, one that's free in Topeka. There's violence. There's actually a city that's sacked by Southerners. There's John Brown, this crazy guy right here, who's going to just go and basically hack to death a bunch of pro-slave people. It's just completely crazy what's going on in this Kansas-Nebraska Act. And eventually what happens is the Southerners kind of get control of the government here, and they pass the Lecompton Constitution, which actually just included slavery in it. So, I mean, it's kind of ridiculous. It was just kind of messy what was going on there. The violence spread to D.C. Here you have the very popular or very famous Senator Sumner get beaten by Brooks. So here you can see this picture of this guy beating the senator, with his cane. And so the violence that is seen here erupting because of Kansas and kind of like the quasi-civil war going on in Kansas between the pro-slave people and the anti-slave people is just really showing that this issue of slavery has become violent. It's ready to boil over. And it might have boiled over even earlier. In 1856, there was an election between Buchanan and Fremont, and many Southern states had actually threatened that if a Republican was elected, that they would secede from the Union. And many Northerners who were worried about this actually voted, with the Democrats because they didn't want to see the country get torn apart. So 1856, it's kind of like we dodge a bullet. We're very close to secession at this point, but it doesn't happen. The Democrats prevail, and so the South feels somewhat protected for at least 4 more years. But they already kind of threw that threat out there that if a Republican was elected, and the Republicans are a brand new party at this point, and they're basically very much anti-slavery, anti the expansion of slavery, I should say, that the South feels like the Republicans are just basically a sectional group, and if they become if they win the presidency, they feel like their rights as Southerners will be greatly diminished. Okay, another big bombshell that's dropped during this period that's going to further lead to division is the Dred Scott decision. Dred Scott basically is a slave who lived with his master for 5 years in Illinois and Wisconsin. He basically sues for freedom on the basis of basically living in free territory. The Supreme Court basically ruled that Scott was a slave, not a citizen, and therefore he couldn't sue in federal courts. The court then went further here and basically said that because slaves are private property, they can be taken in any territory and held in any territory. And so what this effectively does is it pretty much destroys the Missouri Compromise. basically rules the Missouri Compromise unconstitutional. The effects of this are incredibly important. Number one, it incredibly angers the Republicans, but secondly, and probably most importantly, is that it splits the Democratic Party into two. The Democratic Party is the last national party in America at this time. Their other parties are regional or sectional. And if you think about how important political parties are, they do unite us nationally. Republicans, Democrats, there's adherence to both of those parties in all the states here. And when the Democrats split into northern and southern, that's going to let the Republicans have a much better chance of winning a national election. Okay, so here we have Lincoln coming onto the stage here. Lincoln and Douglas have their famous debates. They have 7 of them where they basically argue about the expansion of slavery. And basically what Douglas does is, during these debates, he kind of angers many Southern Democrats by not taking a position about slavery that they would prefer. And this opens the door for Lincoln to kind of walk into the presidency here. In addition to that, you have John Brown, who we talked a little bit about during the Kansas-Nebraska Act part. John Brown becomes incredibly militant. He invades the South. I shouldn't say invades. He launches a raid on a basically munitions post in the South, and basically his objective is to arm the slaves and basically force a slave rebellion. And when the South sees this, they're like, "Oh my God, the North! They're trying to overthrow us. They're trying to arm our slaves." And the South obviously is very concerned by this. Okay. On top of that, the election of 1860, you have Lincoln, who's nominated for the presidency. He's very much against the expansion of slavery. He's all about a protective tariff. He's about a transcontinental railroad that goes to the north. Basically, all these issues the South doesn't agree with. They see Lincoln as being a sectional candidate or a regional candidate, and so basically when this guy gets elected, the South's going to feel very threatened, and Lincoln does obviously win. And so what happens is that, sorry, the bell just went off there. When he wins in 1860, he wins as a minority president, but he definitely wins in the Electoral College. And when he wins here, this is going to basically start secession. And if you look at this map here, it shows you how secession worked. Okay, the Deep South is not going to stay in the Union with Lincoln as president, and so these blue states here, they leave the Union right away. They pull out. Okay, and then these gray states here, these are the states that aren't going to pull out until after the first shots of the Civil War are fired. So these states right here, like Arkansas, Tennessee, North Carolina, Virginia, they hold off on secession. Okay, and then these blue states, these are going to be important here because these are going to be these states that are slave states, but they're not going to join the Confederacy. Okay, and so now you have the secession started, and states start to secede from the Union even before Lincoln takes his oath of office. Okay, so anyways, we're going to stop there for today. We'll pick up with the Civil War. I know I kind of threw a lot at you there. But anyways, follow me on Twitter if you'd like. There's my website with all my chapter PowerPoints and or Google presentations, I should say, and also my podcast. Follow me on my YouTube channel or Twitter, like I said, and email me if you have any questions. All right, guys, hopefully this helped. Thanks.